Genesis chapter 7. The title for the message I've given it today is God's Flood Prevails. I was thinking to title it something like God Prevails Through the Flood, but then that kind of implied that God was a victim and kind of outlasted the flood or something. But what I mean is God's flood prevails. It wins the day. God succeeds. God's flood prevails. Genesis chapter 7. What I would like to do today is to read the chapter and then to review just a few key points from what we've already considered in this flood account. Then I want to work through the passage, kind of what the main things are and things to notice. And then the last thing I want to do, last two things, is one, to look at some of the topics, the important things we ought to learn and glean from all of this. And then lastly, to talk about something that's missing in the text that we often put in the text. I think it's helpful to remember that it's not in there. So that's how I want to go through things. So first of all, just then, why don't we pray, and then we'll read Genesis chapter 7. So let's pray. Adam, would you pray? Amen. Genesis chapter 7. We'll start in chapter 6, verse 22. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Chapter 7, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens, also male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth, and Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, Noah and his sons Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. They and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, and every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. All right. That's our text. It's pretty gloom, right? Nothing really positive about this except for verse 23, only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark. At first blush, it seems like that's kind of the only good thing in the whole chapter. But let's remind ourselves of where we are and what we're reading about. First of all, remember what sparked this whole flood and the decision by God to flood the earth. It was the fact that man had corrupted and ruined God's creation. And again, I just want to stress this point, I don't think it can be stressed enough, is that the flood is not the story of God destroying the world that He made. The flood is the story of God destroying those who had destroyed His world. Let's be very clear on that. Again, chapter 6, verse 12, and God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, or it was ruined, for all flesh had ruined their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will ruin them with the earth. So God was going to overthrow the whole thing and start afresh. So just remember that the earth itself had been already ruined by man. Also remember, as we begin, the agony and the anger of God at this. It says, the Lord saw in chapter 6, verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry, or was grieved, that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. So God is deeply distressed, you may say, at the way things have turned out. When He made it, when it left His hand, it was very good. He sanctified the whole arrangement to Himself, inhabited the place, was with man. God and man were joyful. Man fell into sin. Man has corrupted not only his own way, but the earth itself. Man has come to such a place that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Man who was made in the image of God, God looks out upon man and does not recognize him in this sense. And then not only that, what's more, the whole creation that God had made to glorify Himself and to testify to His own creative power and kindness and His beauty and these things that are in His mind to create, man has corrupted and ruined the whole thing. So The flood is not the story of God overthrowing the world and destroying the world. It's rather, again, the story of God destroying those who had destroyed his earth. The earth had already, in God's estimation, been ruined. And he sets out now to make things right in some measure. Also, just by way of review, to remember that as the flood story begins in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, you kind of have a preamble or a before we begin, let me tell you these things kind of section to the flood story. And the thing that it tells us before the story gets off the ground and really begins to move forward, it says in verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So what you need to know about Noah before we begin talking about the flood is, first of all, he had 3 sons. That's important. That'll come up, and you need to know those are the only ones that he had. But more than that, you need to know one thing about Noah. He was godly. And it's so this point is so stressed by Moses that he says it 3 different ways. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. So he doesn't want you to miss this. No matter what else happens, don't miss the fact that despite all how wicked mankind was, Noah was an exception to that. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his generation. In fact, Noah was walking with God. The last person we read about who walked with God didn't even die. They didn't die at all. God just took him. So Noah was like that. Noah walked with God. He was righteous. He was blameless, even in this kind of a generation. And so that's what we need to know about Noah. And then we just gone through and finished the rest of Genesis chapter 6. Last time I spoke, speaking about what God said he was going to do and the instructions he gave to Noah to build this boat, because it was going to house, who was it going to house? Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives, right? So 8 people. And all of these animals. And so he says you need to build it this big and this tall and this long and this wide. This is what you need to build. Build it with this window kind of thing around. Do all of that. So this is what happens. Put a door on the side, and Noah does this. And we read in Genesis 6:22, Noah did this, he did all that God commanded him. And we begin then in chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark. So I want to just work through the text in sections. The first section is verses 1 through 10 of Genesis 7. And kind of the heading here, this is all kind of tied together with this. God commands Noah to board the ark and gives specific instructions about the animals. We need to know this is a 7-day process. So it took 100 or 120, however many years it took Noah to build the ark. Maybe a little bit less than that. We don't know. It took a long time to build this massive ark back then. He builds it, and then God says, okay, get on board. And he says, on 7 days I'm going to bring the flood of the waters. And this is what happened. So verse 10 says, and after 7 days the waters of the flood came upon the earth. So the process of boarding, and Noah had already stored up all this food and everything, but now it's time for him to get on the ark and for all the animals. This is a 7-day process. So it tells us that several times. So let's just begin to look then. Genesis chapter 7, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. So what was the purpose of putting these animals on the boat? To keep their offspring alive on all the earth. Now that's kind of an obvious thing, but when we think about the flood, I think we usually think about people dying. We think about Noah and his family being preserved, and all the animals were safe. No, all the animals were not safe. All the animals were killed, except for these 2 for every kind of animal, or 7 if you were considered a clean animal. Of all the time, not to be wallowing around in the mud and be this filthy, dirty animal, this would be the time. Like right? You want to come in your Sunday best, as they say. So you have these animals. We don't know on what lines were clean and unclean distinguished, or clean and not clean, the way it's worded here. I don't know. We don't know exactly. Later, right, the Israelites had clean and unclean animals. Other cultures had clean and unclean animals in different ways. They had animals that, like in Egypt, you had to be an Egyptian to have certain kind of food. You know, the good stuff was only for the Egyptians. You could have other kinds of meat. An Egyptian wouldn't eat those things. That's an abomination to an Egyptian. But an Egyptian eats the things that are the good food. It's not really clean and unclean the same way the Israelites thought of it, where things were unholy and it was an offense to God to be eating certain things. But so, you know, we don't know on what basis Noah decided what was clean and unclean or what he understood. But we do know that later of these clean animals, of the birds and also of these clean animals, he did sacrifice to God. So it's probable, as I think of it, and you're free to disagree. I mean, you're welcome to disagree with me on this, but I feel like probably it's, as men think about the animals surrounding them, there are some that are just, that's just gross. That's not clean, right? They don't want anything. I'm not going to eat that thing. I don't want anything to do with that. Or just you see the lifestyle of this animal, and it's just kind of gross and disgusting. And these other ones, they seem clean, they keep themselves, it's just better. It may be as simple as that. And it's those kinds of animals. We're going to offer sacrifice to God. It's from the ones that are clean. We don't want the ones that are doing these other things. It's the clean ones that we want. It could be as simple as that. Or it may be something deeper and more abiding. And some men would want to say that. But we don't really know. It's not important for us to know. But God says this in verse 4, "For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." God says before he brings the rain, he tells you how long it's going to last. It's going to last 40 days and 40 nights. And if you look at verse 12, "And rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights." I want to say something here just by way of apologetics, or the way Christians talk about the flood, and they talk to non-believers, and people say, oh, you know, how do all the animals fit on the ark, or what would they all eat, or where would you put all their dung, or what would you do with this, or what, you know, how did Noah build this thing, or where's all the water come from? And there's all these kinds of questions that people have. I just want to say, I guess, that nothing happens here that's not perfectly within God's control, pre-designed by God. I mean, how are you going to get rain to fall on the earth 40 days and no more? You're just going to shut it down. Everything about this whole thing is miraculous. It's not just, well, it rained a really long time, and that's the extent of the miracle, and nothing else that did God have to do that was just kind of a mighty miracle. Like everything here is. And I hope you'll see as we work our way through here some of the cosmic upheaval that happens in this kind of a situation. This flood upon the earth. It's not just we had a lot of rain and we didn't have anywhere to put it and we all died. It's way bigger than that. And so, I mean, there are answers to the questions that people have. There are some answers. Sometimes they ask a question and we don't have an answer. We don't know, but we know it happened. And that's enough. So just to say that God said exactly ahead of time what was going to happen, and he worked it out just perfectly according to his plan. He says, "For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." Verse 5, "And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him." Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. They went in there to escape. It wasn't a joyride. They were fleeing for their lives, and they knew it. And they went in to escape. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, or they came in rather by pairs, is what we mean. By pairs, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the water of the flood came upon the earth. And then it begins, so that's the flood begins. God commands Noah to board the ark, gives these instructions. Noah boards the ark. This takes 7 days. And after those 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. The next section, this flood really begins, verses 11 through 16. We read basically a lot of the same details we just read, but we read them again. Things are happening again. And if this sounds repetitive to you, it is, and it's intended by Moses to be repetitive, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. In the 600th year, I already said Noah was 600. Look at verse 6. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came. Look at verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life. I mean, I hope we've seen so far in our time of Genesis that Moses does not repeat things unnecessarily. In fact, we often find he's leaving tons of things out that we really wish he would have included. And he just breezes past because he has a very specific agenda. And we read here again and again and again about 2 by 2, a male and a female of this kind and that kind and this kind and that kind and that kind. They all got on board as Noah was told. And then Noah was 600 years old. And then on the 600th year of his life, on this month, on this day, let me ask you, does it matter to any of you what day and what month it was in the 600th year when the flood came? I could care less. I'm just trying to nail down in my mind and in the mind of people I know that it happened. I could care less how long it happened and how old Noah was. But Moses wants you to know, and he wants you to know, we've said before, because there are all these we live in a day when people just think there was no flood. But Moses is writing in a day when everyone has their own idea of what the flood was and what happened and who the guy was and how he tricked the gods and how he got away with things and what he did and how he was a great hero. And Moses is saying, you don't understand. Noah was 600 years old. He barely made it. God gave him all this notice. He told him everything to do. And it's a totally different idea. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, so when you think about, they had 7 days to get everybody loaded up, and then the flood was coming. The rain was coming, and the fountains of the deep were going to burst forth. The idea you ought to have is like they're loading the last of them up as the rain begins to fall. Right? So this is what happens. On this day, what happened? So the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, on the 17th day of the month, that exact day, what happened? The fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. What else happened on that day? On the very same day, Noah and his sons Shem and Ham and Japheth and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with him entered the ark. They and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, and every winged creature. They got in, but they didn't get in until that final day. So it's like a 7-day process, and we're not done until the last day, the last possible second we get in. It's right when it says they went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. They were escaping. They were fleeing for their life. There was no time to waste. They went into the ark with Noah, verse 15, 2 and 2 of all flesh in which there was the breath of life. And here we go again. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. I want you to notice a couple things about this section we just read here. When it talks to us in verse 11 about the day that it was, and then it says, now this is what happened on that day. What we read here, you shouldn't just yawn and say, oh yeah, the fountains of the great deep, they burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. We're talking about things that haven't happened before and haven't happened since. You remember... Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I'll stop there. We'll come back to this point in a minute. But just to say, this is it's a violent kind of thing. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth. What does that look like? The fountains of the great deep, they burst forth. You might not have known they were down there. I mean, how many fountains of the great deep are there? What is that even? Well, they burst forth. And what else happened? And the windows of the heavens were opened. Now, sometimes when the Bible talks about rain, it talks about the windows of heaven were opened, but it never talks about that unless it's kind of a great rain. And I think we could all say, judging by the context, we're talking about a kind of raining that we've not known. It's like monsoon, 40 days and 40 nights. It doesn't stop. And so this great thing that happens. I mean, I don't know if you can picture it in your mind or just what this looks like. We had 7 inches of rain the other day here in Hannibal. I don't know what you guys had in Quincy, but I know you had a lot too. 7 inches. It was like a little more than 24 hours. That was a lot of rain. A lot of rain. That's nothing. Nothing compared to this. I mean, that water level's got to be rising like 4 or 5 feet an hour. What they're seeing. Between the waters that burst from the great deep and the rain that comes from the sky. So just notice the violence of it. The waters of the great deep burst forth. 40 days and 40 nights of rain. It was a frightful sight. And what does he say in verse 16? And the Lord shut him in. The Lord shut him in. What does that mean? I mean, why is he shut? The Lord shuts him in. Maybe for his own safety. Maybe to prevent Noah from trying to get somebody else. Maybe to prevent other people from getting on board the ark. I don't know. I'm tempted to think Noah wasn't trying to save the other people, and we'll get to that later. But God shuts him in. Now, that's a key point too, because in almost all the other flood stories, the hero of the story who tricked the gods, or who had one god on his side and the other gods didn't know it, one of the things that guy does, he shuts himself. He builds this door and he closes it up and bars the door. It's very different. God shuts him in. God shut him in. It may well be, if I were to take my cues from maybe what Peter says, the Lord knows how to rescue the righteous. It may well be that if it weren't for God shutting the door, they never would have got shut in the right way. They never would have been safe. Very possible. The Lord shut him in. Our confidence can rest in that, right? There's a great flood out there. I'd be happy to know that God had sealed this door. Wonderful. So the Lord shut him in. So then, let's just continue on. Verses 17 through 24, there's kind of 4 things I want you to notice. The extent of the flood, the duration of the flood, so how far did it get and then how long did it last? Extent, duration, devastation, how bad was it? And then exception. So we've got 2 E's and 2 D's, okay? So the extent of the flood. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole of heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. Let's stop there. Now, we read here in those verses about just the waters of the flood just increasing and increasing and increasing and increasing. 4 times we read about some level of increase to the level of water that is on the earth. 3 of those times it says prevailed. So we start here. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. That's the first. Waters are increasing. Now we're going to talk about prevailing, and it mentions it 3 times. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated, or the ark went on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed, second time to say prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Verse 20. The waters prevailed above the mountains. So they were covered, but then even above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. So if a cubit is about 1.5 feet, then we're talking, 22, 23 feet, somewhere 20 and 25 feet deep, somewhere in there. The tallest mountains were covered with 20 to 25 feet of water. It prevailed. You're meant to be shocked and amazed. It's staggering. So 3 times we read about the water prevailing. And if you notice just the whole verses 17, 18, 19, 20 are all about just the increase of the waters. I mean, it says, the flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased greatly and bore up the ark, and it rose high, and then the water prevailed even more, and the ark was going around on the earth. And then the water prevailed even more, and the mountains were covered, and then it prevailed even more, and they were covered 15 cubits deep. You're meant to stagger at the sheer extent of the flood. Everything is underwater again. There is no, I'm going to stand on the tall mountain and make it up to my neck, and I made it. Like nothing. Nobody flees to the high mountains and lives. The extent of the flood. The duration of the flood, notice. The flood continued 40 days on the earth, but then look down to verse 24. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. 150 days. So roughly 5 months of this. Right? You've got a flood of waters on the earth for roughly 5 months. That's a long time. In fact, if I were to go into chapter 8 and compare what I read in chapter 7, look at chapter 8. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. This is verse 4. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. 7th month, 17th day. The flood started, it says, the 2nd month, 17th day. So exactly 5 months. However Noah was figuring his months, it was exactly 5 of them from that point of the story to this other point of the story. 5 months. 150 days. What a thing. It lasted 150 days before God began to send a drying wind. That's the duration. What's the devastation? Look at this, verse 21. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything, actually let me say this. When it talks about the devastation, it mentions this devastation, it repeats this 4 times. But it does it in pairs. Look at this. The first pair, in verse 21, we're talking about all flesh. Let's see. Let me find it here. Yeah, verse 21. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Look at verse 22. Everything on the dry land, in whose nostrils was the breath of life. So here you have all flesh that moves on the earth, and then that's explained. It's enumerated. What do we mean? Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. All flesh died. Don't miss this. All flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind, they all died. And he sums it up. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life, they died. That's the first pair. Now let's look at the second pair. Verse 23. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. You might say, well, didn't he just tell me that? Yes, but he's stressing this. It's not just that these things died. It's talking specifically about what God did. Yes, God sent a flood, and yes, these animals died. But more specifically, God blotted them out. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. And then he summarizes it. They were blotted out from the earth. You see this? He says this 4 times. All flesh on the land died. Not only did they die, specifically God blotted them out. He goes out of his way to tell you it's not just that the flood came and they all died, but that God willfully blotted them out and put it. It's like every person and every animal that died in the flood, God personally saw to it that they individually, specifically, they were blotted out. Think of that for a moment. Every one of Noah's neighbors and his extended family and the people that lived on the other side of those mountains over there and across the valley and everybody, the guy he had just sold whatever to, all of these people, the guy he bought this thing or that thing from, all these people were specifically targeted by God for death. He blotted them out, every single one. And none were missing. There was no lone survivors. Only those that God shut in the ark. Which brings us to our exception. The end of verse 23. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. Only Noah was left. The only one who was left was the one who was walking with God and those that were with him. What a thing. The only one left. Only Noah. Now, we have read a lot in this chapter about this kind of animal and that kind of, the birds of the air and every winged creature, and the livestock and the cattle and every beast according to its kind and all the creeping things and all this. Does that remind you of any language from anywhere else in Genesis that we've already read? Doesn't it sound like Genesis 1? The earth is swarming with swarms of creatures, and there are birds that fly overhead, and these are winged creatures. Then you have of the animals, you have the beasts, and you have the livestock. And you have man, and it's just everything according to its kind. That phrase is borrowed as well. And it comes again and again and again. Moses is trying to help us glean from this. One of the things we ought to glean, and he's doing it by comparing Genesis 1 and what we have here. The original creation and this account of the flood. We're meant to be thinking about Genesis 1 as we read the flood. Now, some topical points to cover, and this is where some of the things will start coming together for us. First of all, I want you to notice the obedience of Noah to complete the task and to follow through as commanded by God. Remember, before this whole story begins, what you need to understand is that Noah was a righteous man. He was a godly man. So God comes to Noah, who at the beginning of the story stood apart in his generation as unique and distinct as one who cared about God, right? He wasn't sinlessly perfect, but he walked with God. He really did. And he's totally different than everybody else. And God says, okay, I'm going to destroy the whole world, but you and your family and a bunch of these animals are going to make it, and that's it. But you got to build this boat. You got to build it a certain way, and you got to gather up all the food for everybody, and this is what you have to do. In chapter 6, verse 22, Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. You see Noah's obedience here. Imagine if Noah would have said, well, God is going to flood the earth, but he already said he didn't want me to die. So I don't need to build the ark. Right? It's not a big deal because God wants to preserve me. It'll all work out. That's not the way it was. Noah was a righteous man. Because he was a righteous man, he did do what God told him to do. And he followed through. He obeyed God. He carried through with the things God commanded him to do. And because of his continuing to walk with God, he preserved his soul. He preserved his life. If he'd turned back on God at this point and said, no, I'm not going in, or I'm not going to build it, there's no Noah. So notice his obedience. Noah was righteous, but he had to go on with God in order to be delivered. That's such a fundamental truth, right? This is the way it is with God. You can't live on yesterday's grace. You've got to press on today and tomorrow. You've got to make it through all the way to the end. You've got to persevere. Some we know, we've seen, made shipwreck. I can name people, friends of mine, who've made shipwreck of the faith. This happens. We've got to press on. Noah also had to continue with God. Notice also the sovereignty of God over this whole thing. The whole chapter is about God's actions, God's guidance, God's control. The only one who does anything is besides God is Noah, and he only does precisely what God tells him to do. Do this, build it this way, this, store up this food, and then all these animals are going to come to you. This is what they're going to do. Put a door in there, and then, okay, I'll shut. You guys get in. You got 7 days. I'm telling you, go now. Hurry up. He does it, and then God seals them in. It's all what God does. Then we get to chapter 8, and it's like God remembers Noah. And then God makes the wind to blow on the earth. I mean, God brings the rain. He calls forth for the fountains of the great deep to burst forth. God does all of these things. Everything that Noah's doing, God's involved in. Everything that's happening in nature, God's bringing. It's all about God's action, God's guidance, God's control. This stands out in stark relief again to the way that other religions thought about the flood. Many of them, the gods, were angry with all the noise and the clamor that humanity was making, and they're getting too many of them, and they were serving us, but it's almost like the Egyptians. You know, they say, well, we've got these Israelite servants, and now there's too many of them, and we're going to start treating them bad. We're going to weed them out. And this is the way they think of the gods are thinking this way, right? We're going to destroy humanity. We don't like what's happened. And they send the flood, and they're scared to death, and they go running for their life. And then they're all sorry because, well, now who's going to make us our food? This is literally, I'm not making this up, this is literally the accounts. How different that is from God calling forth the waters and sending a wind to dry things up later, and God orchestrating and directing everything. Or you have some gods who are angry and want to destroy all humanity, and then another God who says, oh, but I like this one guy over here. I'm going to tell him about it, and we're going to build a boat. And everybody's going to want to know what he's doing. You got to lie to everybody, because if people find out that we're sending a flood, then all the other gods are going to do something different. So this is ridiculous. It's so different than what we read here. And when you realize what these other stories are that are going around, you realize why it matters for Noah or for Moses to give us these details as they occurred. Because it was nothing like what other people say happened in the flood. God was in absolute and total control. There was no one scheming against him, no other gods to hide his plan from. Nothing like that. But I also want you to see this, and we're talking about the sovereignty of God here. I want you to see this, the flood account, as in some sense an undoing of the original creation. An undoing of the original creation. You may remember in Genesis chapter 1, before God began everything, there was, what do we read? I'll just read it here. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And then he goes on, and then verse 6, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters. Let us separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse heaven. There was evening and there was morning the second day. And then we get to the flood, and the waters of the deep burst forth, and the windows of heavens are opened, and God floods everything. And even the tall mountains, it's all covered. Where is this distinction between the dry land and the waters that God made? Where is this separation between the waters above and the waters below? I mean, the waters above. So you're out there, you're standing in the valley, and you look out over the mountains, and like, oh, those clouds, they're even up there over the mountains. And in the flood, the waters get up there over the mountains. There's nothing left. It's all water. Everything's taken back. It's like it's all just set up right back there again to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. What happened? An undoing of the original creation. What a thing. We'll see this later on too when Noah steps off the ark. And even in chapter 8 as things begin to dry out. And it's so similar to what happens in the original creation account. But so you see here in the flood an undoing of God's original creation. which is staggering because remember, God has said this was all very good. We know He's committed to this. We know He promised Adam, or He swore to the serpent that He was going to raise up a seed from the woman who was going to undo all this and set everything right. And then before any of that happens, God just destroys it all. Puts it back like it was before He started creating, in a sense. And that's where we leave, right? That's where chapter 7 ends. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in this ark. Think about the whole world being put back to what it was, in a sense, to before God had begun dividing and separating everything up in a limited way, right? There's still stars in the sky, and there's still the sun, and all those things still there. But in some sense, hitting the reset button, only now, the only thing that's there is there's this boat floating around the water. There's a few people in it and some animals, and that's like it. All that's been preserved of God's creation is right there in that boat. This is what God does when man ruins His creation. When His creation is ruined, God sets about and just He said He was going to blot man off the face of the earth, and He does. He washes His world clean of the filth of men. So, when we're talking about the sovereignty of God over these things, I also want us to think about the wrath of God upon the world of man. This happens to us. The flood is meant to be, for us, an example. If the flood happens, if for no other reason, to serve for us as a sobering reminder that God means business with sin and with sinners. God judges sin. We're told specifically, why did the flood come? Because of the sin of men. God judges sin with deadly and devastating anger. And people were dying. We've heard it said again, how many babies died in the flood? Well, all of them. Right? God meant business with this flood. He judges sin with deadly and devastating anger. Now think of this. Hear me, pay careful attention here. It is the prerogative of God, or His freedom, to rid the world of corruption and evil at any time He so chooses. It is the prerogative of God to rid the world of corruption and evil whenever He so chooses. But not only is He free to do so, it's His prerogative. He can do it if He wants to. Listen to this. Listen to me now. It is the stated will of God to do this. He stated it here in Genesis. This is what I see on the earth. I'm going to rid my world of it, and I'm going to do it in this period of time, and it's going to happen. But He has promised us He will do it again. Finally, perfectly, completely. Never have to do it again. We read this over and over in the Bible. It's God's stated will to do this kind of thing again, finally and perfectly. That ought to sober us up when we think about the wrath of God. We tend to think of the wrath of God as this thing kind of out there for other people. The wrath of God is coming upon this world, where you live and where I live. The question is, will we escape? Will we escape? What else do we see? Last things in terms of these topics. The carefulness of God to see to it that His purposes for creation is sustained and all of His promises are fulfilled. And everything we've been reading so far sounds like He's undoing everything and He's just kind of gave up. But that's not it at all. Again, the flood is not the story of God aborting His creation and starting afresh and anew and deciding to do something different. But rather we see the carefulness of God to preserve that original creation. He speaks to Noah years and years and years in advance. What was it God wanted with humanity? He wanted a bunch of worshipers on the earth. And so He finds the only worshiper on the earth. And He speaks to him about preserving him and his family so that humanity can continue on. He finds the one guy in all the world who had a heart to God. God finds him. The eyes of the Lord, they go around to and fro throughout the earth. And he found Noah. He was so careful to find him and to instruct him and to preserve him and all the animals. I mean, I know there are people who say, well, the dinosaurs probably, none of them were, made it, right? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not going to weigh in on that necessarily, but I will say this. We read over and over again how careful Moses is to say that every one of these animals, all according to their kinds, they were there on the ark. They were preserved so that nothing was lost. Whatever it was that God had made, it all makes it. God's creation makes it through the flood. On the other side, to repopulate and become, in a sense, what it was supposed to be. Yes, still on an earth cursed with futility. God hasn't forgotten all that, but in some sense, start afresh without such corruption from men. To purge it, to clean it. We might ask this question: how much, when we think of the flood, how much will God do in order to ensure holiness upon the earth? How far is God willing to go to make sure that this earth is holy to Him? Is there a line that God is not willing to cross in order to make sure that He has holy men on the earth? And I say what we see here is, we might theologically have to say, yes, there are things God wouldn't do. But in terms of experience in history, we say, I'm not sure what that thing would be. He flooded the whole earth. He killed every animal and every human being on the earth, apart from what was in this boat. Apart from the ones He specifically chose to be preserved in this boat, He killed everything. You're telling me that God, who began and spoke the world into existence over a period of 7 days and inhabited the place, said this is very good, this was a delight to Him, He's willing to flood all of that and kill all these animals that are a delight to Him, do so many of these things in order to get His purpose accomplished, to see His promises fulfilled and His purpose maintained. God has a purpose for His creation. It's as though nothing is sacred to God like that is sacred. No man can say, but then I would die. And He says, well, then your life is forfeit. No animal, but then we would die. Well, then your lives are forfeit. No world, but the whole world would be washed away. Well, then it's washed away. We'll start again. Peter can say, and he does say, that the world that then existed was destroyed. Everything is expendable in the light of God's eternal purpose for His creation. I want to read one passage here, and then we'll move on to the very last point, which won't take long. Psalm 104. Very famous passage. I just want to read it so you to understand how serious God is about His ultimate purpose. Psalm 104, verse 1. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, You are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering Yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of His chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds His chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes His messengers winds, His ministers a flame of fire. He set the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved. You cover, and then listen to what He does after all this. Now we're talking about the flood now. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At Your rebuke they fled. At the sound of Your thunder they took flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place that You appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From Your lofty abode You water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of Your work. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock, and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats. The rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers. He made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness, and it is night, when all the beasts of the forest creep about. The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they steal away and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work and to his labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan, which you formed to play in it. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your Spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works, who looks on the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. We stop for a second. All we've seen so far is what God did in the original creation, what God did in the flood, when he said waters will come no more, it'll stay there, we're not going to again cover the earth. And we've just been looking at all the wonderful things that God has done and that he does and that he delights in. Verse 31, again, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May this glory of God endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. So we're talking about a delight that God has in all of these things working the way they're working. He's rejoicing in his works. And he looks on the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. Let sinners, listen to this, be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Praise the Lord. The author here has gone from speaking about God's delight that he's speaking about the wonder of what God does in creation and how these things just, in a sense, look to God. The lions are looking to God. Everything's looking to God. Everything's made with an orientation to God and relating in that way and functioning in that way and glorifying God in the sense that it's functioning as God intended. And God is rejoicing greatly in all these works. And then the author turns and says, well, may the things going on in me, may my life be pleasing to you. May my meditation be pleasing to him. For I rejoice in the Lord. I want the Lord to delight in me as I delight in him. May my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. And let those about whom this could not be said, who don't rejoice in the Lord, and whose meditation is not a delight to God, may they be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. And you might stop and think, whoa, what a turn this has taken. But it's not at all. It's just simply the whole theme of the psalm is delighting in what God has made and the goodness of it, and wanting God to enjoy it, and wanting God to receive what he ought to out of what he's made. And that means the death of the wicked. Let the wicked be no more. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Praise the Lord. So when we come to the flood and we think about God being determined for his purpose, the destruction of the wicked, the wiping away, the washing away of the sinfulness of men is part of that. It's actually a step closer to what God originally intended. There's far less wickedness. There's far less evil. There's far less corruption and violence and ruin to the world when it's washed clean of men. But the amazing thing is, God's determined that man will be part of this glorified creation. And so he's got to preserve them. And men need animals, and the animals delight God as well, and so he preserves them as well. It's not just the absence of sin that God wants, it's the presence of a worshiping people and a delightful creation. This is what he wants, and he preserves it through the flood. He washes the world clean, he starts afresh, and he gives instructions, he covenants with Noah and with all of us and with the animals about what he won't do again until it's all come to pass. And one day he sends his own son to make everything right. to bring us back. But you see the sovereignty of God and the carefulness of God to see His purpose for creation sustained and all of His promises fulfilled. Now, last thing, and we'll be quick with this. There's something missing in this chapter, Genesis 7. I think it's very common for people to think of Noah as someone who went about spending much of his time pleading with his neighbors to turn to God, pleading with them to repent, that they might be saved and they wouldn't die in the flood. And I want to just wipe that idea out of your mind because it didn't happen. Now, I want to turn to two texts where in the New Testament where you might say, well, here's some places where maybe we're getting that from, this idea. First is Hebrews 11, and verse 7, we read this, "By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith." So that's one text about Noah. So by faith, he had been warned by God concerning these events that were yet unseen, and in reverent fear he constructed an ark for the saving of his household. I want you to key in on this, for the saving of his household. By faith, God spoke something to him, and then by faith, believing specifically what God said, he acted in reverent fear to do exactly that, and what he was trying to do was to save his own household, not his neighbors. But 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5 is the text that's often used. 2 Peter 2:5. "If he," that is, if God, "did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly." That's it. He's called a herald of righteousness, or some would say a preacher of righteousness. And they say, well, it must have been, and you hear this all the time, Noah was a preacher of righteousness. He was pleading with his neighbors about their sin and for them to get right with God. Where is that? Imagine, if you will, for a second, you're in Noah's shoes, and God says, listen, I'm so fed up with the entire world, I'm going to destroy everything that breathes. But I am going to preserve you and your wife. You've got 3 kids and they've got wives. And then I'm going to preserve 2 of every kind of animal. And what you need to do is build an ark exactly this size and store up food for those that I'm going to preserve. If the time of the flood comes and God says there's 7 days and Noah says, well, we've got 10,000 people we're going to bring, it's not going to work. Not at all. God told him specifically what to do. And we were told from Hebrews that in reverent, believing exactly what God said, build this boat, and me, my wife, my 3 kids and their wives, and these animals will be safe. And in reverent fear, he proceeded to do exactly what God said, seeking to preserve his household. Which means then that as some neighbor of Noah, somebody walks by and says, what are you building? Noah doesn't say, well, this is what God's going to do, and this is what's going to happen, and you need to repent of your sin and come on board. And the guy says, the only reason the guy doesn't come is because he's laughing at Noah because he's a fool or something. That's not it. Rather, Noah becomes the old man who everyone laughs at when they ask him, what are you doing? And he says, God's going to destroy the earth, and he's told me if I would build this boat that these animals would be safe and my family would be safe. But because of your sin and the wickedness of mankind, God's going to judge the world, and that's what's going to happen. You ought to get right with God. They say, what an old fool. What a kook. And some 99-year-old old man says, he's been building that thing since before I was born. He's like a broken record. Every day Noah goes out there and he just works on this stupid boat. What in the world is he thinking? What an idiot. What time's that wedding again? Right? And this is the way life is. But Noah's not trying to get anyone else on the boat. God told him only those who would be on the boat. It doesn't mean Noah never talked with anyone about sin and their need to get right with God. He was a righteous man. But there was no invitation There was, he wasn't selling tickets to the ark, right? He wasn't giving free passes away or anything like that. Before the boat was built, it was determined who the passengers would be. And it was built with them in mind, and no more. So just understand that. I bring it up because we're in chapter 7 where that would occur. That's the part of the story where many times we think of Noah doing this, and it just didn't happen. Well, are there questions or comments on this section of Genesis chapter 7?